Hello, today we're going to begin our look at U.S. History Chapter 18, the Civil Rights Movement. In Section 1, we look at the situation, the transition with the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-1900s as the Civil Rights Movement began with an effort largely to end segregation in the South. Our learning objectives are to list the key issues in the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and to explain its impact, and to explain how events in Montgomery, Alabama helped to launch the modern civil rights movement. So first of all, looking at civil rights prior to 1954. Pre-1900, of course, we had opposition to slavery in the colonial period, and then the abolition movement began prior to the start of the Civil War. After the Civil War and Reconstruction ended, we had legalized racism. And then in 1896, dealing with the legalized segregation of the races, a challenge was mounted in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And there the Supreme Court established a new doctrine known as the separate but equal doctrine, which ultimately said that you can have a separation of the races so long as equal facilities are provided. Now, looking at the period from about the end of the 1800s, or the turn of the century, up to about 1930, kind of in the late 1800s, we had Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were two of the strong African-American leaders. Although they disagreed on the best approach, both of them were strong leaders. We had the founding of the NAACP back in 1909, and then during the Great Depression, African Americans suffered worse than many others. For example, when national unemployment reached about 25%, it was worse in some areas, particularly the African American neighborhood of Harlem. It reached a staggering 50%. And Roosevelt was unwilling to push too hard for greater African American rights. Now looking at the period kind of between 1930 and 1940, it was during this period that A. Philip Randolph forced a federal ban against discrimination in defense work. And in the 1940s, they founded CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948, and the Brooklyn Dodgers put an African American, Jackie Robinson, on its roster. So the fight for equality. Many African Americans served bravely in World War II. After the war, they felt that they had earned equal treatment, and they were ready to fight for equal rights. So they really began to seek change in the courts. The NAACP attacked racism through the courts, and in the 1930s, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall began a campaign to attack the concept of separate but equal. The NAACP began to chip away at the 1896 Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, which once again provided the legal basis for racial segregation. Some examples: in 1938, Missouri ex rel. Gaines versus Canada, Registrar of the University of Missouri, and 1950 Sweat versus Painter. Then, Thurgood Marshall began to focus on desegregating the nation's elementary and high schools in the 1950s. He found a case in Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court combined several school segregation cases from around the country into a single case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court was aware of the case's significance. The Supreme Court heard arguments over a 2-year period. The court also considered research about segregation's effect on African American children. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren issued the Supreme Court's decision. All 9 justices agreed that separate schools for African Americans and whites violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection of the law. Specifically, in their decision, they said that separate is inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. this now leads us to the integration of the schools. So now once we know that segregation is illegal, efforts were made to start integrating the schools. And this brings us to the Little Rock crisis. So the Supreme Court's ruling did not offer guidance on how or when desegregation should occur. Some states integrated quickly while others faced strong opposition. Virginia passed laws that closed schools who planned to integrate, and then in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor violated a federal court order to integrate Little Rock's Central High School. And this brings us to the Little Rock Nine. On September 4th, 1957, angry whites harassed 9 black students as they arrived at Little Rock Central High School. The Arkansas National Guard turned the Little Rock Nine away and prevented them from entering the school for 3 weeks. Now, it's important to note that the National Guard is a department of the Army, but they are under the direction of the state in which they are based. So we're talking the Arkansas National Guard. They're under the direction of the governor, who is using the Guard to turn away these students. Finally, President Eisenhower intervenes and sent U.S. soldiers to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school. The events in Little Rock revealed how strong racism in some parts of the country was. And now we come to Montgomery, Alabama. And we start really with the Montgomery bus boycott, which starts when, in 1955, a local NAACP member, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat on a bus to white riders. The resulting Montgomery bus boycott led to a Supreme Court ruling that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. So what ends up happening with Rosa Parks is quite literally, when she refuses to give up her seat, she ends up being arrested because she's violating the law. Like I said, this results in a massive protest, really led by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So African Americans formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, to protest the activities taking place in the South. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was elected the leader of this group, which once again was committed to mass nonviolent action. Dr. King had been greatly influenced by the example set by Mohandas Gandhi. And this leads us now to the Montgomery bus boycott. When Rosa Parks was arrested, the NAACP called for a one-day boycott on the city's bus system. Community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and selected Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. African Americans continued to boycott the bus system for a year, which hurt the bus system and other white businesses. After the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional, integration of the buses moved forward. Now we're going to be looking at the Freedom Now campaign. And the main idea for this section is that the quest for civil rights became a nationwide movement in the 1960s, as African Americans won political and legal rights and segregation was largely abolished. Our learning objectives is to analyze the strategy of nonviolence in the civil rights movement. Civil rights workers used several direct nonviolent methods to confront discrimination and racism in the late 1950s and early 1960s. These included boycotts, sit-ins, and freedom rides. Many of these nonviolent tactics were based on those of Mohandas Gandhi, a leader in India's struggle for independence from Great Britain. American civil rights leaders such as James Farmer of CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, and Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and others shared Gandhi's views. James Lawson, an African-American minister, conducted workshops on nonviolent methods in Nashville and on college campuses. The sit-in movement. 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, stayed at their seats at a Woolworth lunch counter after being refused service because of their race. Over the next few days, protesters filled 63 of the 66 seats at the lunch counter. The students were dedicated and well-behaved, and ended each sit-in with a prayer. Over time, protesters in about 50 southern cities began to use the sit-in tactic. The Freedom Rides. In 1960, the Supreme Court ordered that bus station facilities for interstate travelers must be open to all passengers, but this ruling was not enforced. Corr sent a group of Freedom Riders on a bus trip through the South to draw attention to the situation. Mobs angry at the Freedom Riders' attempts to use white-only facilities firebombed a bus in Anniston, Alabama, and attacked riders with baseball bats and metal pipes in Birmingham. Now looking at the results of these nonviolent tactics. The sit-ins succeeded at getting businesses to change their policies, and it marked a shift in the civil rights movement. It showed that young African Americans growing impatience with the slow pace of change. Leaders formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC. The Freedom Rides. After savage beatings in Birmingham, bus companies refused to sell Freedom Riders tickets, and Corr disbanded the Freedom Ride. Federal intervention. SNCC continued the Freedom Rides. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent federal marshals to Montgomery to protect the riders. The Interstate Commerce Commission finally forced the integration of bus and train stations. Now we're going to look at the integration of higher education in the South. By 1960, the NAACP began to attack segregation in colleges and universities. In 1961, a court order required the University of Georgia to admit 2 African American students. Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes suffered, but both graduated in 1963. In 1962, James Meredith tried to enroll at the University of Mississippi. He arrived on campus with 500 federal marshals and was met by 2,500 violent protesters. President Kennedy went on national television to announce that he was sending in troops. The troops ended the protest, but hundreds had been injured and 2 killed. A small force of marshals remained to protect Meredith until he graduated in 1963. In 1963, the governor of Alabama physically blocked Vivian Malone and James Hood from enrolling at the University of Alabama. And now we want to look at what role was played by Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama in the history of civil rights. Local officials in Albany, Georgia ignored the Interstate Commerce Commission's new integration rules. Birmingham, Alabama was known for its strict enforcement of segregation. So, the Albany movement. SNCC began a sit-in in Albany's bus station. Over 500 demonstrators were arrested. The federal government was informed but took no action. Local leaders asked Martin Luther King Jr. to lead more demonstrations and to gain more coverage for the protest. He agreed and also was arrested. The results. The police chief, Laurie Pritchett, had studied King's tactics and made arrangements to counteract the nonviolent protest. When the press arrived, King was released and city officials would only deal with local leaders until King left. Once King left, officials would not negotiate at all. The 9-month movement failed. Now we can contrast this with what happened in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King raised money to fight Birmingham's segregation laws. Volunteers began with sit-ins and marches and were quickly arrested. King hoped this would motivate more people to join the protest. White clergy attacked King's actions in a newspaper ad. And then King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail. Fewer African Americans were willing to join and risk their jobs. The results? A Southern Christian Leadership Conference leader convinced King to use children for his protest. More than 900 children between the ages of 6 and 18 were arrested. Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor used police and firefighters to break up a group of about 2,500 student protesters. The violence of Connor's methods was all over the television news. Federal negotiators got the city officials to agree to many of King's demands. And here's a quote from the letter in the Birmingham jail. Dr. King said, quote, "Why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." Another incident that happened in Birmingham, Alabama was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. It was bombed on Sunday, September 15th, 1963. The explosion at the African American church, which killed 4 girls, marked a turning point in the U.S. The 1960s civil rights movement had contributed to support for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So now looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. With regards to President Kennedy, the events in Alabama convinced President Kennedy to act on civil rights issues. Kennedy announced that he would ask for legislation to finally end segregation in public accommodations. Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, was shot dead in his front yard. Ku Klux Klan member Brian De La Beckwith was tried for the crime, but an all-white jury failed to convict. The March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, the largest civil rights demonstration ever held in the United States took place in Washington. More than 200,000 people marched and listened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Passing the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson supported passage of a strong civil rights bill. Some Southerners in Congress fought hard to kill this bill. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law on July 2, 1964. The law banned discrimination in employment and in public accommodations. And now we're going to look at voting rights. The main idea is that in the 1960s, African Americans gained voting rights and political power in the South, but only after a bitter and hard-fought struggle. Our learning objectives is to summarize the efforts to expand voting rights for African Americans. Voting rights for African Americans were achieved at great human cost and sacrifice. President Kennedy was worried about the violent reactions to the nonviolent methods of the civil rights movement. Attorney General Robert Kennedy urged SNCC leaders to focus on voter registration rather than on protest. He promised that the federal government would protect civil rights workers if they focused on voter registration. The 24th Amendment outlawed the practice of taxing citizens to vote. Hundreds of thousands of people volunteered to spend their summers registering African Americans to vote. So, registering voters. SNCC, CORE, and other groups founded the Voter Education Project, or VEP, to register Southern African Americans to vote. Opposition to African American suffrage was great. Mississippi was particularly hard. VEP workers lived in daily fear for their safety. The VEP was a success. By 1964, they had registered more than 500,000 more African American voters. The 24th Amendment. Congress passed the 24th Amendment in August of 1962. The amendment banned states from taxing citizens to vote, for example, poll taxes. It applied only to elections for president or Congress. Freedom Summer. Hundreds of college students volunteered to spend the summer registering African Americans to vote. The project was called Freedom Summer. Most of the trainers were from poor Southern African American families. Most of the volunteers were white, northern, and upper middle class. Volunteers registered voters or taught at summer schools. And then we had a crisis in the state of Mississippi when Andrew Goodman, a Freedom Summer volunteer, went missing on June 21, 1964. Goodman and 2 CORE workers had gone to inspect a church that had recently been bombed. President Johnson ordered a massive hunt for the three men. Their bodies were discovered near Philadelphia, Mississippi. 21 suspects were tried in federal court for violating civil rights laws. The results of the Project Freedom Summer. The organizers considered Mississippi's Freedom Summer Project a success. The Freedom Schools taught 3,000 students. More than 17,000 African Americans in Mississippi applied to vote. State elections officials accepted only about 1,600 of the 17,000 applications, so less than 10%. This showed that a federal law was needed to secure voting rights for African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders wanted to help President Johnson defeat Republican Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential election. These leaders agreed to suspend their protest until after Election Day. SNCC leaders refused, saying they wanted to protest segregation within the Democratic Party. SNCC helped to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They elected 68 delegates to the Democratic National Convention and asked to be seated instead of the all-white delegations sent by the state's Democratic Party. Fannie Lou Hamer told the convention's Credentials Committee that why the MFDP group should represent Mississippi. President Johnson ordered a compromise. 2 members of the MFDP delegation would be seated, and the rest would be non-seated guests of the convention. The NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference supported the compromise. SNCC and the MFDP rejected the compromise. The MFDP's challenge failed in the end, and it also helped widen a split that was developing in the civil rights movement. The Voting Rights Act, the Selma Campaign. King organized marches in Selma, Alabama to gain voting rights for African Americans. King and many other marchers were jailed. Police attacked a march in Marion, and King announced a 4-day march from Selma to Montgomery. 600 African Americans began a 54-mile march. City and state police blocked their way out of Selma. TV cameras captured police using clubs, chains, and electric cattle prods on the marchers. The Voting Rights Act. President Johnson asked for and received a tough voting rights law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed in Congress with large majorities, and it proved to be one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed. Now we're going to look at changes and challenges to the civil rights movement. And the main idea is that continued social and economic inequalities caused many young African Americans to lose faith in the civil rights movement and integration and seek alternative solutions. Our learning objectives are to explain why the civil rights movement expanded to the North, to explain how and why the civil rights movement fractured, and to describe how the nation reacted to the death of Martin Luther King Jr. So, the civil rights movement expands to the North. The civil rights movement had done much to bring an end to de jure segregation, or segregation by law. However, changes in law had not altered attitudes, and many were questioning nonviolent protest as an effective method of change. In most of America, there was still de facto segregation, or segregation by custom and practice, rather than by law. African Americans outside the South also faced discrimination in housing, by banks, and in employment. Looking at conditions outside the South, most African Americans outside the South lived in cities. African Americans were kept in all black parts of town because they were unwelcome in white neighborhoods. Discrimination in banking made home ownership and home neighborhood improvements difficult. Job discrimination led to high unemployment and poverty. Urban unrest. Frustration over the urban conditions exploded into violence. Some examples included Watts, a neighborhood in Los Angeles, which erupted in violence in 1965, and Detroit in 1967. President Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission to study the causes of urban unrest. And they placed the blame on poverty and discrimination. The riots convinced King that the civil rights movement needed to move north. He focused on Chicago in 1966. The 8-month Chicago campaign was one of King's biggest failures. Chicago's African Americans did not share his civil rights focus. Their concerns were economic. King discovered that some northern whites who had supported him and criticized racism in the South had no interest in having it exposed in the North. Fractures in the civil rights movement. Conflict among the diverse groups of the civil rights movement developed in the 1960s. Many SNCC and CORE members were beginning to question nonviolence. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party and called for violent revolution as a means of African American liberation. Malcolm X and the Black Muslims were critical of King and nonviolence. Stokely Carmichael became the head of SNCC. SNCC abandoned the philosophy of nonviolence. Black power became the new rallying cry. And they wanted African Americans to depend on themselves to solve problems. The Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party was formed in Oakland, California in 1966, and they called for violent revolution as a means of African American liberation. Members carried guns and monitored African American neighborhoods to guard against police brutality. The Black Muslims. The Nation of Islam was a large, influential group who believed in black power. The message of black nationalism, self-discipline, and self-reliance was something in which they embraced. Malcolm X offered a message of hope, defiance, and black pride. And now we come to the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King became aware that economic issues must be a part of the civil rights movement. King went to Memphis, Tennessee to help striking sanitation workers and led a march to City Hall. James Earl Ray shot and killed King as he stood on the balcony of his motel. Within hours, rioting erupted in more than 120 cities. Within 3 weeks, 46 people were dead, 2,600 were injured, and more than 21,000 were arrested. And now we're going to look at the next section, looking at how the movement continued. And the main idea is that the civil rights movement was in decline by the 1970s, but its accomplishments continued to benefit American society. Our learning objectives is to explain how the civil rights movement changed in the 1970s. King realized that most African Americans were prevented from achieving equality because they were poor. Ralph Abernathy, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the new leader after Dr. Martin Luther King, led thousands of protesters to the nation's capital as a part of the Poor People's Campaign. The campaign turned out to be a disaster. Bad weather and terrible media relations marred the campaign. The campaign also failed to express clearly the protesters' needs and demands. The civil rights movement took place at the height of the Cold War. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover created a secret program to keep an eye on groups that caused unrest in American society. Hoover considered King and the Black Power movement a threat to American society. The FBI infiltrated civil rights movement groups and worked to disrupt them. He spread false rumors, for example, that the Black Panthers intended to kill SNCC members. They forged harmful posters, leaflets, and correspondence from the targeted groups. And this leads to the decline of the Black Power movement. And we start by looking at the Black Panthers. Hoover was particularly concerned about the Black Panthers. Police raided Black Panther headquarters in many cities. Armed conflict resulted, even when the Black Panthers members were unarmed. By the early 1970s, armed violence had led to the killing or arrest of many Black Panther members. Now looking at SNCC, SNCC collapsed with the help of the FBI. H. Rap Brown, the leader who replaced Stokely Carmichael as the head of SNCC, was encouraged to take radical and shocking positions. Brown was encouraged to take these positions by his staff, many of whom worked for the FBI. Membership declined rapidly. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. This also was called the Fair Housing Act. Busing and political change. To speed integration of the city's schools, courts began ordering that some students be bused from their neighborhood schools to schools in other areas. Busing met fierce opposition in the North. Busing was a major cause of the migration of whites from cities to the suburbs, and this kind of became known as white flight. This development increased the political power of African Americans in the cities. Affirmative action programs were programs that gave preference to minorities and women in hiring and admissions to make up for past discrimination against these groups. Black power took on a new form and meaning in the 1970s. African Americans became the majority in many counties in the South. African Americans were elected to public office. African Americans who played roles in the civil rights movement provided other services to the nation. Thurgood Marshall became the Supreme Court's first African American justice. John Lewis represented the people of Alabama in Congress. Andrew Young became Georgia's first African American member of Congress since Reconstruction, and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and the Mayor of Atlanta. Jesse Jackson founded a civil rights organization called Operation Push and campaigned for the Democratic presidential nomination in the 1980s.